Okay, I make that just about 9:05, so we'll make a start. I think we're expecting a few more people, but they can pop in. We are recording the session today, so we should be able to share this with you afterwards if anyone does miss out on anything. But first and foremost, good morning, and thank you for everyone for attending our Countryside COP workshop. This is actually in alignment with our first YEN Zero discussion workshop of the 2023-24 year. And our session this morning is going to be looking at how we can mitigate emissions associated with crop production, and we'll focus in on nitrous oxide emissions specifically, and the management we can do to reduce our nitrous oxide footprint from arable farming. So I'm Megan Tresise. I'm going to be chairing the session. You'll be hearing a lot from me this morning. I'm a climate and sustainability consultant at ADAS. I've been in the business now for about a year, and my role, whilst fairly varied, I do a lot of the greenhouse gas accounting and net zero agriculture and climate change piece. I'm also finishing off my PhD at Leeds Uni, which also looks at net zero agricultural emissions as well. So just a quick bit of housekeeping before we start the session this morning. We've disabled cameras and microphones just for now because we're in sort of a webinar environment right now. So please do keep them off unless you're asked to turn them on. There will be an option later on once we've done our polls for people to turn on cameras and to share ideas and thoughts on those. If you do have questions as we go through, we have put up a Q&A feature which should look a little bit like this icon here in the Teams toolbar. So please do feel free to use that. Laurie, who's on our YEN Zero team, will be monitoring that. So if you have a question that comes up that you really like, please do upvote it by giving it a thumbs up. Laurie will be reading off sort of the most popular questions and asking that of me and Toby later on. And as always, if you need to use the bathroom, then please do feel free to do so. And we're also going to try and save the chat of this event. So if there's any questions that come up that we haven't been able to cover, then we should be able to get around to those later on. But please do use the Q&A feature where you can. So as mentioned a couple of slides ago, this workshop is part of the third Countryside COP series, which is happening mostly this week in November. And this topic, what we're talking about today, and really what YEN Zero is about, sits quite nicely in this food and water systems part of the Countryside COP themes. So the agriculture sector has this target of net zero emissions by 2040, if you look at the NFU. So it's important that we start taking actions today to start moving in the right direction, going towards tomorrow. And the objective of these events in Countryside COP is to establish the next steps and the recommendations for encouraging progress towards climate change mitigation, essentially, specifically for the agricultural community and industry. This is the agenda for this morning's workshop. We are going to start by, I'll start by giving you a brief introduction to what YEN Zero is, how the network runs, and how you might be able to get involved if you're interested. Then Toby and I will talk about how we reduce nitrogen emissions from crop production, and we've got some bits of YEN Zero data to show you and illustrate, how big of an impact nitrous oxide emissions have on the footprint and what we can do to mitigate those. We'll then hear from Will Oliver, who is one of our YEN Zero growers, and he'll be giving his perspective of greenhouse gas mitigation on his farm. Then we'll have around 15-20 minute Q&A session. So we'll pick out the most highly rated questions and answer them for you. So please do start putting questions in the Q&A box. We do have some questions that we've put into polls all around nitrogen management, and we'd like to share those with you and get your opinions on those. So that will be the time where we'll put on cameras and microphones. If anyone wants to join in the conversation, maybe share some success stories or challenges and watch outs, that would be a really great discussion piece around that. And then lastly, we'll just summarise the poll findings, and then I'll bring the meeting to a close at around 10:30. And just to mention as well, if you are collecting basis or Noroso points, then please do put your details in the chat box. Laurie is also collecting that information, so we'll be able to send that off and get those points registered for you. So the YEN Zero network, I actually took over this project this year. I took over management of this project, and something that I can tell straight away about this is that this arena, this topic is constantly changing, not just the agri-policy side of things, but the science is constantly updating. So as a network, we also need to be improving and updating and meeting what the industry and what growers ultimately need. So we've established a community of crop producers and agri-industry stakeholders to share knowledge, share ideas, share solutions, to be able to combat the key challenges that we face in a net zero agricultural system into the future. We use key metrics, and we look at trends in the data to understand what works best for what farm. So we're in our third year of YEN Zero now, and we're starting to build up this nice database of information that we can pull out key greenhouse gas trends and key mitigation practices that work really well for different types of farming system. Our YEN Zero year will typically run from around August round to June of the following year. And within that time, we raise sponsorship for the year. So we get involved with key agri-industry stakeholders, and they sponsor the YEN Zero network to allow growers to input their data, to have a crop footprint done, and to have mitigation practices advised. So we collect and we analyse the crop growers' information, and we produce an interim results report and a benchmarking report, and we provide a tailored approach to mitigation strategies. We also hold a few different workshops, discussion workshops throughout the year. So this being our first of the YEN Zero year, which obviously everyone's invited to, we've aligned it with Countryside COP. And then we also have a results meeting around springtime where we discuss all the key findings from that year's YEN Zero results. And we look at the benchmarking analysis and sort of see where people are sitting and highlight those really successful mitigation practices in action. And YEN Zero is industry funded. We won't be able to do what we're doing without our sponsors making this possible. So being able to sponsor growers to have their carbon footprint done, and to sponsor the network, improving and expanding every year. So the sponsors that we have help steer what we're doing and make sure it stays relevant to what the industry needs and what grower needs as well. So these are our sponsors for this year. So I know a few of them on the call. So thank you very much for attending, and thank you very much for your sponsorship of this year. We won't be able to run the network without this support. So what's involved if you're going to be a part of YEN Zero? So in the past, what we've done is growers can submit up to 6 fields of any previous harvest year, and we record that. So you might have, one field 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. You can do up to 6. You can do less than 6. That's not a problem. From this year onwards, we've actually started trialing a rotational approach as well. So basically, you can enter for the same field up to 6 years worth of data historically. So depending on which approach you'd like to use, we've got the option there for this year. We've created a data portal to be able to handle that information. So we will then pull that information from the portal, analyse it, and produce reports that are sent back to the grower. We cover most combinable crops. And yeah, the data portal and the questions that we ask are sort of improving every year, depending on what the industry and what the sector actually needs to create a robust footprint. Our carbon footprints are reported on a per hectare basis and a per tonne basis, and we break this down into the main emission sources associated with crop management. And the data that's entered into the network is benchmarked against other growers, so of similar farm types, similar crops, for example. And what we do is we produce a whole sort of page in the report, which is all about mitigation strategies. And we'll go into this a little bit later. We produce a mitigation tree, and you'll be able to understand what sort of things to implement first, what might be easier to implement, what might be a bit harder to implement, more costly, etc. But the ultimate aim of this mitigation piece is to be able to help growers to understand what to prioritise and what can be done first, and what can be sort of, put into plans for long-term investments and things like that. And as discussed previously, we hold several different discussion workshops throughout the year. So there are lots of opportunities for our growers to get involved in the conversation. And we hold our results meeting in spring when we've got all of the data through. And this is what some of the graphics in our benchmarking report looks like. So we tend to use box and whisker plots to show things like the highest and the lowest YEN values, which is the top and bottom ends of that line that goes through these boxes here. So it's the highest and the lowest value. We have the middle 50% of the YEN values, which is represented by this grey box. And then the black line that runs through the box is the middle YEN value. And then these colourful lines here are sort of where your crops would sit. So in this example here for a milling winter wheat, this grower's crop sits on the lower end of this middle 50% of YEN values, for example. So we're presenting graphs of all the crops together, and we're looking at greenhouse gas emissions per hectare in this one. We do also break things down to field level in our report. So this is an example of that milling winter wheat again. In the report, we look at yield and we benchmark your yield against other growers, the greenhouse gas emissions per tonne, so the emissions intensity of that wheat. And then, as I said, we also break things down into the key emission source categories, and we do that on a per tonne basis as well. So this colourful line here is where the growers' emissions would sit in comparison to the rest of other milling winter wheat growers in the network. If you're interested in getting involved with YEN Zero, people can join through either a sponsored or an independent entry. So we do actually have some sponsored entries left for this year. If you are interested in getting involved and want to have a crop footprint done, then please do get in touch. It will be first come, first serve for obvious reasons. There's the yenzero@adas.co.uk email address on the page there. So please do feel free to email through if you're interested in having this done. Or you can also enter as an independent grower. Independent entries cost £350 plus VAT. So as I said, yeah, there are some sponsored places still available. We will be putting that out on social media soon as well. But you've heard it here first. And an important thing to mention, because obviously the data entry process can be quite long and quite challenging at times. But entrants in the YEN Zero network can have supporters on their account. So if you've got other staff members on your farm or agronomists, advisors, for example, you can put their emails down in your entrance and they can help you with the data entry. They also get like a login information to be able to help you put in the data. All of our entrants are also sent a welcome pack. So this provides all of the key information around data entry and some of the important activities and dates in the network for the year. Okay, so our main session today then is going to be on reducing nitrogen emissions from crop production. So this is delivered by myself and my colleague Toby Townsend, who's a principal consultant in the climate and sustainability team at ADAS. And really what we need to do first is introduce you to the importance of understanding greenhouse gas emissions in crop production. And in a crop system, in agriculture in general, actually, we have three key greenhouse gases of concern. We've got carbon dioxide, which is CO2, we've got nitrous oxide, N2O, and we've got methane, which is CH4. So they're represented by these colourful bubbles on the screen. And what we've tried to do is just illustrate which greenhouse gases come into which emission source category here. So all of these gases have a warming effect on our climate, and where we've got an accumulation of these gases in the atmosphere, we're seeing more climate impacts on the agricultural systems, and agricultural systems are vulnerable to these climate impacts. So things like flooding, droughts, intense rainfall, extreme heat, all climate impacts that are really quite serious for agriculture and make it really unpredictable and challenging for growers to adapt to these things. If we took a typical crop production system and just a snapshot of emissions, we're going to be seeing CO2 from vehicles. So this is our fossil fuel combustion, perhaps diesel in our tractors. We're going to be seeing CO2 from heat and power in farm buildings. So that might be oil or gas, for example. That could be anything in a crop production system, from grain drying or potentially sort of cooling of potatoes, for example. And then we'll also see some CO2 from our tractor field maintenance here as well. Nitrous oxide becomes quite a big part of crop systems, and we get a lot of nitrous oxide emissions when we put nitrogen onto the land. So this is a large part of the footprint, which is represented with this larger arrow here. We also get some nitrous oxide emissions when we apply organic amendments like slurries, manures, digestates, for example. And we might also get some methane associated with that as well, depending on what the conditions are at the time. And then another important emission source that's not really, it's a combination of CO2, methane and nitrous oxide, depending on where it's come from. But this is our embedded emissions footprint. And this comes from all the inputs that come onto farm. Each of those has an embedded emissions footprint that needs to be accounted for in the assessment. So things like the emissions associated with the manufacture of fertilizers, or emissions associated with the production of wheat seed, or with pesticides, for example. And although we're not going to be touching on the sequestration and storage piece in today's session, it is important to mention as well that if you have actively growing vegetation on your farm, that will be sequestering carbon and hopefully storing that long term in your soils and in that vegetation. And if you're putting organic amendments on your soils, then you should be getting a bit of carbon addition to those soils as well. So this is average YEN Zero greenhouse gas emissions data then. This is winter wheat, winter oilseed rape and spring barley from the 2022 harvest season. And these pie charts capture the key greenhouse gas emissions from operations, which is things like diesel consumption, the embedded emissions in the seed, the embedded emissions in the ag chemicals, so like pesticides, the manufacture of nitrogen fertilizer, manufacture of non-nitrogen fertilizer, so our P and K fertilizers, nitrous oxide emissions from crop residues, and then nitrous oxide from fertilizers and organic amendments. And these pie charts illustrate quite clearly in all cases, the biggest slice of the pie sits with this nitrous oxide from fertilizer and organic amendments, and that's typical of most arable crops. The nitrogen fertilizer manufacture typically sits between sort of a fifth to a quarter of emissions for arable crops. Crop residue nitrous oxide can be quite high. It depends on whether residues are left on the field or not. Obviously, the benefit of leaving residues on the field is also the improvements in soil carbon when that's broken down. So a bit of a trade-off with that one. And if we look at this for winter wheat then, and we break this apart, we're looking at 62% of the total emissions footprint of wheat coming from nitrogen fertilizer manufacture and the nitrous oxide that comes from the application of manufactured fertilizer and organic amendments to soil. So a really large chunk of the pie that we can do something about, and we can manage nitrogen in a way that reduces that overall footprint. And Toby's now going to highlight some of those mitigation options that we have for nitrous oxide and how we can reduce that part of the footprint. So Toby, do you want to take control of the slides?
Yeah, thank you, Megan. So I'm going to look at these two key sources of emissions. So the emissions from the manufacturing of the nitrogen fertilizers that we use on farm, and then those nitrous oxide emissions that occur after we apply nitrogen to our fields. So I'm going to look at where these emissions are coming from, what options we have to reduce those within our arable systems, and also having a look at how YEN Zero considers these emissions within our carbon footprinting. So first of all, I'm going to consider the emissions from manufacturing nitrogen. There's four key ways that we're going to talk about how we can reduce those emissions. So first of all, can we choose fertilizers that have been made in a more efficient way? So fertilizers where there's a lower embedded emissions within the production process. The next step is to reduce the amount of manufactured fertilizer we're using by replacing some of that with organic nitrogen sources. So for example, can we replace some manufactured nitrogen with manures instead? There's a range of different products coming onto market that provide the opportunity to either have a lower embedded emissions within them, or provide the opportunity to actually reduce the amount of nitrogen that we're applying. And then the final aspect is, can we reduce fertilizer use through optimizing application rate? So can we consider how much nitrogen are we applying? Is there a possibility that we can reduce that amount of nitrogen without compromising the performance of our crops? So I'm going to look at those in a bit more detail now. So first of all, can we select those manufactured fertilizers with lower emissions? Now, in the UK and the EU, fertilizer manufacture has actually become more efficient, and the carbon footprint has decreased over the past 10-15 years. We've actually seen over a halving of those emissions, and that's partly through improved efficiency of the process, as well as the uptake of abatement technology, so special technology to reduce the amount of nitrous oxide being produced when we're creating these fertilizers. So that's actually resulted in, over the past 10-15 years, our carbon footprints on farm decreasing without the farmers actually having to take any actions themselves. Those embedded emissions have decreased. That is, of course, dependent on the growers selecting fertilizers produced in the EU. Because actually those emissions for fertilizer production are very variable depending on where that fertilizer is produced. So I have a graph here showing the emissions for producing various fertilizer products in different regions of the world. And if we compare EU production, so this is kilograms of carbon dioxide per kilogram of product, we see that China's emissions are about 3 times as high as those emissions for EU production. So depending on where we select our fertilizer from has a big bearing on the embedded emissions within it. So actually supporting farmers in being able to select the fertilizers with lower emissions will help them to reduce their overall carbon footprint. And there are various calculators and tools out there to help farmers select the fertilizer that has lower embedded emissions. More and more fertilizer producers are providing a carbon footprint for their products. The next option is to replace some of that manufactured nitrogen with organic nitrogen sources. So if we're looking at organic manures, these don't have embedded emissions associated with them. All of those emissions associated with actually creating that manure are allocated to the livestock system. So they come onto farm for our arable system without any embedded emissions. Another option is to use nitrogen fixing crops. So if we can grow some leguminous crops that are able to produce nitrogen, that means that we don't have to apply manufactured nitrogen. And if we consider that across our arable rotation, that gives us the opportunity of reducing the amount of manufactured nitrogen that we're using and therefore the carbon footprint of our rotation. Yeah, okay, sorry, the slides are a little bit slow. So then we move on to novel fertilizers. So there are some different fertilizers that we can use that will help us to reduce our emissions. So there are various products that are being developed at the moment. Some of these are not available yet. Some of them are just becoming available. But over the next decade or so, I expect us to have a lot more choice about what we can use in our arable systems. So I've highlighted some novel fertilizers here. So there are 2 key pathways that are being developed, and that's a blue ammonia pathway and a green ammonia pathway. With the blue ammonia pathway, so that's basically producing that fertilizer in the way that it's currently being produced, but instead of releasing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, we're sequestering that instead. And that offers us the opportunity to reduce emissions by 60 to 80%. There's green ammonia, and this is actually produced in a different way. So what that uses is an electrolysis-based process. So rather than bringing in fossil fuels, we use electrolysis using renewable electricity to produce the hydrogen that then we use to create ammonia. And that process can potentially be, net zero if we're depending on where we get our electricity from. So there is a lot of development in that area to provide these fertilizers. There is actually a bit of competition in terms of other industries are eyeing up ammonia as a potential green fuel source. So, for example, shipping, green ammonia has been talked about as a potential fuel for shipping. So there is a bit of competition here, but I expect to see these type of fertilizers becoming more and more available. We then have other products. So there's a range of different products on the market that provide the opportunity to enhance soil biology or plant pathways that enable that plant to better access the nitrogen. So if we can enable that plant to better access that nitrogen, it means that we can apply less to the field. And this is a developing research area. The final aspect, so optimizing nitrogen use, I'll talk about in a couple of slides' time. But first of all, I'm going to look at how does YEN Zero account for these emissions from manufactured fertilizer? So in our calculations, first of all, we take into account the amount and type of fertilizer applied to the field. We then have some default fertilizer emission factors, and these are based on figures supplied by Fertilizers Europe, so the sort of organization that provides resources around fertilizers, and they have a carbon calculator for assessing the emissions from fertilizer production. And their figures are used quite widely by carbon calculators. These figures have emissions data for Europe and other regions of the world. So based on where that fertilizer is coming from, we have an average value. However, for the time being, within YEN Zero, we assume that the fertilizer is produced in Europe. And part of that is because it might not be obvious to the grower where their fertilizer has come from. So to keep things simple, we assume that the fertilizer is produced in Europe. We do, however, allow bespoke emission factor figures to be included within YEN Zero. So if a grower has a fertilizer that has a specific carbon footprint associated with it, we can include that within our YEN Zero calculations. And finally, when it comes to organic fertilizers, we assume there's no embedded emissions associated with those. So that's the emissions from manufacturing fertilizer. Next, we move on to the biggest source of emissions within our arable system, and that's the nitrous oxide that's being created when we apply fertilizer to our field. And this has various different names depending on what you're looking at. So some people refer to it as field emissions or fertilizer emissions. But basically what we're talking about are those nitrous oxide emissions that are coming from our field. And this nitrous oxide results from the activity of soil microorganisms. So you can see that figure on the right there, and you can see there's a lot of different forms of nitrogen, and that nitrogen's moving between those forms. What happens when we apply nitrogen is that there's various different pathways that it takes. Microorganisms are taking in that nitrogen, they are metabolizing it into different forms of nitrogen, and then that might be taken by a different microorganism, or it might be taken up by the plant. So we have this complex movement of nitrogen within our field. And the way that I look at it is that it's a bit of a competition here. We apply that nitrogen, the microorganisms want it, our crops want it, and depending on those specific conditions, so soil characteristics, weather conditions, how we're managing our crop, determines where that nitrogen ends up. And we have emissions of nitrous oxide occurring through 3 different pathways. So the first one, and this is the main source of nitrous oxide emissions, is the direct pathway. And this is basically where that nitrogen is being taken and goes through various processes in soil microorganisms that eventually result in nitrous oxide being produced and released into the atmosphere. And these are influenced by a range of different factors, so the amount of available nitrogen, temperature, and rainfall. And a key thing here is that if we're applying our fertilizer during warm and wet conditions, that's going to result in a greater release of these direct nitrous oxide emissions. We then have 2 indirect nitrous oxide loss pathways, and the end result is the same, that nitrogen is converted into nitrous oxide, but with these 2 indirect pathways, there's an intermediate step. So when it comes to atmospheric deposition, the nitrogen is being lost from our field as ammonia or nitrogen oxides. It's then deposited somewhere else, so usually outside of the farm boundary. It's deposited, and then that the nitrogen in there can be converted into nitrous oxide. And that's influenced by the type of nitrogen available and the temperature of the conditions. We then have our leaching and runoff pathway, and that's basically where the nitrogen's in a form that can be washed away from the field, so it could be leached through the soil or as lost via surface runoff. And then once that's deposited somewhere, that can be then converted into nitrous oxide. And that's influenced by the amount of available nitrogen and the amount of rainfall as well. So we have these three pathways. So actually, when it comes to understanding the creation of nitrous oxide from our the application of fertilizers, there's a lot of complexity there, and it's influenced strongly by the specific conditions when that fertilizer is being applied. So how can we go about reducing these emissions? Now, considering this is the biggest source of emissions within our arable system, this is something that we should be putting a lot of energy into if we want to reduce our overall emissions. So first of all, there's optimizing nitrogen application rates. So can we reduce the amount of nitrogen we're applying without compromising crop performance? And this could be through, for example, nutrient management planning. Can we apply our nitrogen in a way that limits emissions? So thinking about timing and method of application. And are there technologies that potentially we could use to reduce those losses? So, for example, nitrification and urease inhibitors. So first of all, nutrient management planning. So we want to optimize the amount of nitrogen that we're applying so that we can limit how much is lost to the environment and how much is taken up, and increase the amount taken up by the plant in order that we can achieve the best yields possible. So the kind of things that we're doing with a nutrient management plan is to balance the different sources of nitrogen. So, for example, how much manufactured nitrogen we're applying versus organic nitrogen. And it's understanding how much nitrogen our crop requires so that we're not applying any more than it actually needs. So this could be through testing soil and organic materials to understand how much nutrients are already in there, using decision support tools, so for example Planet or Manna NPK, to help us decide, understand how much we should be applying, and using the guidance, for example, within RB209. And these nutrient management planning can be a really important way of reducing emissions. Obviously, the more efficient you are at applying them now, the less benefit there will be from nutrient management planning. But for those who haven't been doing this, there's a real potential for reducing emissions there. In terms of timing and method of application, so as we saw when we were looking at the direct and indirect nitrous oxide pathways, temperature and moisture content are factors that influence those levels of production of nitrous oxide. So if we can time our application to make sure that it's happening at the right time, we can reduce those losses. So for example, if we're applying fertilizer when there are higher temperatures, that increases the risk of nitrous oxide emissions. If we're applying them during very wet periods, we potentially also have high nitrous oxide emissions. So we want to make sure that we're applying that fertilizer during the right conditions, so cooler, drier conditions, and also sort of making sure that we're applying it when the crop is going to be able to compete with those microorganisms. So when we've got the crop growing. The method of application as well also influences those losses. So in particular for something like organic materials where there's a risk of volatilization, so the production of ammonia, if we can get that that nitrogen into the ground, so so it's not exposed, then we reduce the risk of volatilization. So having something like an injection of slurries or rapid incorporation of solid manures, that reduces the risk of losses of ammonia. And then we have these nitrification and urease inhibitors. So these are becoming more and more available. And the idea behind these is that they restrict certain pathways. So we saw in that figure earlier, all of those arrows where nitrogen's moving between different forms and different between different pools. The nitrification and urease inhibitors block off certain pathways there, and that reduces the amount that's potentially lost and gives the crop more opportunity to utilize that nitrogen. So I won't go into the details here, but basically they provide this opportunity to reduce those losses. In cases, they potentially make nitrogen more available for the crop. So that could potentially allow a reduction in the amount of nitrogen applied. However, as we've already mentioned, weather conditions have a big influence on the movement of nitrogen around the system, so those different loss pathways. So nitrification and urease inhibitors might not always have much of an impact because actually the weather conditions aren't leading to those losses anyway. But under certain conditions, they could be really beneficial in reducing those losses. So how do we account for these nitrous oxide emissions from arable systems within YEN Zero? So first of all, we take into account the amount and type of fertilizer applied. And then when it comes to the direct and indirect emissions, we calculate those emissions based on a UK-specific emission factor. So as I've said, the weather conditions are a big influence on those loss pathways. So really, we need to be taking into account the climate when it comes to estimating these losses. So we use a UK-specific emission factor that takes into account average annual rainfall. So that means that in a drier part of the country, those emissions will be lower than in a wetter part of the country. And our approach is aligned with that of the UK greenhouse gas inventory. So the calculations that are used to work out the UK's annual emissions, we use the same calculations there. We have some elements of mitigation, so we're able to capture some of the actions that farmers are taking to reduce their emissions. So for example, we can include inhibitors in there, so nitrification and urease inhibitors. If a farmer is using those, that leads to a reduction in these emissions within YEN Zero. We do take into account application method for manures. So if they are rapidly incorporating manures when applying them, that leads to a reduction in indirect emissions. But we don't currently delve too much into the timing of application and how it interacts with specific weather conditions. So YEN Zero just considers the annual rainfall amounts. It doesn't consider how rainfall might vary between months. So at the moment, we're not taking into account that timing aspect and its interaction with weather conditions. But this year, we're trying to look at the nitrogen in a bit more detail. So we are considering nitrogen use efficiency. So basically, how well is that crop competing with the soil microorganisms for that nitrogen? So how much nitrogen are we applying relative to how much is ending up in the crop? So this gives us a good idea of how well that nitrogen is being applied and that crop system is being managed. So I'm going to hand back to Megan now.
Yep, thank you, Toby. Okay, so this is just an example of our mitigation tree that we use in our YEN Zero report. So it's a little bit quirky, looks a little bit different probably than some of the mitigation practices and ways of explaining things that you've seen before. But essentially, we've designed this tree that tells you how to mitigate emissions in terms of productivity, fertilizer, energy, and soil health. So 4 main sort of areas of mitigation. And each circle on this tree represents a greenhouse gas mitigation practice. So it'll have a number in, that number corresponds to the table on the right-hand side. The size of that circle will indicate the relative impact of that practice on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So a bigger circle, a bigger impact on greenhouse gas reduction. As I said, these practices are grouped into 4 main categories, so it just helps kind of explain, where to target. You've got 4 different areas to look at. And we will look at a couple of examples from the fertilizer section in that light turquoise blue on the left-hand side, because this is obviously where this presentation delves into a lot. Each of these sort of categories has like a core practice at its centre, and this is foundational really to other practices beyond that on the branch being implemented. And in general, as practices sort of radiate outwards from this core practice, things become a little bit more difficult, potentially a bit more costly to implement. But they often have a bigger greenhouse gas reduction impact. So you can see as we get towards the end, these circles get a lot larger than potentially towards the core of this diagram. So depending on what the grower actually submits in the data entry portal, the practices that are implemented already will be shown in green, which is fully implemented. If they've partially implemented a practice, it will come up as yellow. If it's white, then it means they haven't introduced that practice yet. And actually for this year, we're introducing a grey bubble as well for practices that are not applicable to that farmer. So some farmers may not be able to establish cover crops very well, for example. So if that's not applicable to that farmer, we can take that out of the tree. We can highlight that in grey just to illustrate that one's not possible. And the purpose of this diagram is to help growers identify and prioritise practices that are going to have the greatest impact for the least cost. So what we advise growers when they're looking at this to use it is to basically follow each branch of the tree from this centre sort of core practice outwards until you find a practice that you haven't already done, or maybe you've partially implemented and can maybe invest a little bit into to get that one done. So for example here, I've highlighted this core practice number 11, which refers to the measurement of soil mineral nitrogen, and that's to create sort of a base nitrogen rate on realistic yields and quality expectations. If we follow this branch out, we come to practice 24 and 26, which is related to the use of nitrogen efficient varieties or adjusting the nitrogen rate based on the break-even ratio. And if we follow that branch outwards to practice 25, that's looking at adjusting nitrogen rate according to soil mineral nitrogen and fertilizer recovery. So the point of the diagram here then is that if you can follow your way out towards the end of the branches, yes, the practices may become a little bit more difficult to implement, perhaps a little bit more costly, but they tend to have that bigger greenhouse gas impact. So practice 24, which was looking at the nitrogen efficient varieties, has a smaller impact on greenhouse gas emissions, but maybe a little bit more cost effective to start with, and is a move in the right direction. Even if it's a small move, it's definitely a positive step in the right direction for that one. So that's how we do mitigation practices in YEN Zero. Every grower that submits data will get a report which has this diagram in, and will have a bit of information about how to read that. So hopefully then they can make practical, evidence-based decisions about what practices to do next, essentially. Okay, we're now going to hear from Will Oliver, who's one of our YEN Zero growers, and he's been in the network for a little while now. So hopefully he'll have some good insights about how he's used YEN Zero and perhaps some of the mitigation options that he's put on farm. And Will, if you have anything that you're wanting to do next but you're not too sure about, we can have a discussion about them. Please feel free to talk about that as well. I'll hand over to you now.
Hi everybody, can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
Perfect, thank you very much for that. So no slides from me, I'm afraid. I thought I would just talk about what we're doing on the farm, and rather than put loads of busy slides up with loads of information, I just thought I'd just say it how it is from my point of view. So yeah, this is my second year doing YEN Zero. And basically the starting point for me in all of this is just to measure what we're doing currently, whether you think you're doing anything or not. To start measuring, there's loads of different toolkits out there. I wouldn't even get too hung up about which one you use. I just say pick one and stick with it for now. There's a lot of discussion saying that between them all, but I just say pick one, stick with it. I don't get too hung up about the figures that it gives back, but it's all relative. So if I can improve on what that's telling me, then I work on that. And I just feel like it makes us question our decisions, and it makes, once you realize what data you are collecting and for what reason, you can become a lot more accurate in what you're recording. So measuring is really important. I've been using Farm Carbon Toolkit for 4 or 5 years now, and every year we're seeing an improvement in what we're doing. Whether it's right, I wouldn't be able to tell you, but I'm pretty sure we are improving. Other things that I'm doing on the back of this, fuel monitoring our diesel use a lot more efficiently. We've got a system on our fuel tank where each person in our team's got a chip, and he or she has to put it on the tank, and that monitors what they're using. And that generates its own report that's just recording in the background, and we can pinpoint what fuel use is being used for each job. And then also modern John Deere equipment is, I'm sure other manufacturers are probably doing it as well, but they're doing a lot of work in recording the fuel use, and we're seeing a lot of fuel is being wasted on just tick over. So maybe when we're corn carting, the lads are probably just sitting with the engine on tick over, listening to the radio with the aircon on, and it's quite shocking how much that is costing us. But at the same time, 2 summers ago it was 40 degrees and they need the aircon. So there's a fine line between how you work that out. But other things that I'm doing, benchmarking. So I'm using Yagro, on-farm trials, a lot of tramline trials, so we can try different things, different treatments, and then look at yield maps, look at our cost of production. Is it worth taking it onto a larger scale? That works really well. We're trialing things like seed to soil, like the seaweed-based product, and QLF boost and things like that. Just because you can go on these things and you can believe what people tell you, but without trying it yourself, it's very difficult to know. And then where a lot of the changes that I've found have come is in our rotation. We put in a broiler unit, which I appreciate is a bit of a luxury, but we get 2,000 tonne of poultry litter available to us now each year. So I try and utilise that in the spring. So we dropped rate from our rotation for various reasons, and now we're growing grain maize, and that brings loads of opportunities. So we've now got cover crops. We're collaborating with a neighbouring sheep farmer. We're direct drilling wheat after the maize, and it's forcing us into that late drilling window, which in years like this is a challenge. But our soils are becoming more resilient. So when we do get these, well, I say freak years, but they're coming more and more regularly now. But the soils are definitely becoming more tolerant. And I'm probably not as 2 years ago, we may have panicked and got the plough and combi out. But now I'm thinking, look, there will be a time when we can drill these fields, whether it's a spring crop or not, and just being more flexible in our approach. Because you can make a rash decision and do something rash to those soils, and then you're fighting against that for the next few years. So rotations changed, like I say, with integrated grain maize. Cultivations, we're moving into a more direct drilling system. We do have a carrier and a top down, which we utilise for incorporating manures when we see necessary. I'm cutting down on bagged fertiliser. We're not buying in any P and K. And like I say, we're measuring. So right now I've got 4 probes out across different areas of the farm, which are measuring our soils in real time. So I can open it up on my phone and I can see organic matter, carbon, NPK, all the micronutrients in real time. So I've picked different areas of the rotation to target, and I'm going to see how our farming practices affect available nitrogen, and what we can do to make sure we're utilising these resources and making the best out of them. I touched on direct drilling. I'm not an out and out direct driller, but we've got a horse sprinter Horizon DSX, and we're quite flexible in our approach. This year, for example, slugs are a challenge, and actually where we've direct drilled after maize, we're not seeing any slugs for whatever reason. Whereas in other areas of the rotation after winter beans, we're seeing a lot of slug pressure, which you wouldn't normally find. And it's just being prepared to adapt, because to combat slugs, you may need to cultivate slightly. So we're not saying, oh, we're no-till, because I don't think that's right at this stage, although I am certainly in a reduced tillage situation. I like the grain maize in our rotation. That's quite integral to our approach into reducing our greenhouse gases. I can grow maize without any bagged fertilizer, and then also a lot less chemicals compared to, say, oilseed rape, for example. It's great for our blackgrass control. We're getting less inputs. We're putting all that organic matter back into the soil, so we're getting huge amounts of residues. But like, for example, we were combining maize yesterday. Those residues are on the surface now. They're protecting our soil from any extreme weather conditions, and also the maize that's still in the ground, that's also protecting our soil. So I'm not getting too panicky that we've still got a crop out in the field, because we're having coverage all year round. Also, like I said, with on-farm trials, that is a constant thing that's happening now. We're all getting approached to try different things, whether it's from Syngenta or just local agronomy companies. Just always happy to embrace any trial, just to see how things working, and just to constantly learn. And that's why you do things like YEN Zero as well, because it puts you in a room with people you might not normally meet, and it's just engaging, knowledge exchange. I find it really important. We're also using things like N sensors, because I'm using a lot of organic manures. It's important to see how the plant's reacting, so we're getting the best out of these nutrients. Just finally as well, what I want to touch on, and I'm probably preaching to the converted, but I would encourage anyone to do their facts and basis. With SFI and things now, there's so much opportunity, and a lot of that cost can be put onto your agronomist or your agent that you're using, and a lot of it isn't that complicated. And I'm not academic at all by any means. I went to university and I didn't do very well. I had a good time, made a lot of friends, but I would say put yourself out your comfort zone, and don't be afraid of trying these things, because you learn so much about your own business, and it's a shame to pass that on to someone else. So yeah, that's just a whistle-stop tour of what I'm doing on the farm. I'm sure I've missed loads of things, but yeah, it's all about IPM, and just every decision you make now, we're thinking about, how's it going to affect our cost of production? How's it going to affect our carbon footprint? Is it really worthwhile? Margins are so tight now, every decision's got to be justified. So yeah, that's me in a nutshell. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Will. Thanks for that. I guess as well, it's trying to find co-benefits as well. If you're reducing emissions whilst improving profitability, whilst handling biodiversity, that's always a good win-win situation there as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Lovely. If I move on, so we've now got, we are running a little bit over, but that's fine. We've got a Q&A session now. So Laurie, have any questions come through for myself, Toby and Will?
We have one from Sarah Jones that was on crop residues. So she's asking, does the quantity of emissions from crop residue also depend on the nature of that residue, e.g. carbon nitrogen ratio, etc.?
Yeah, so I believe, Toby, do correct me if I'm wrong, I believe in the crop residue calculations, it's mostly the nitrogen that plays an impact, isn't it? Because it's the above and below ground nitrogen that's taken into consideration for that one.
Yes, so the way that that's calculated is based on the nitrogen content of the residues. So those calculations don't take into account the actual dynamics of what's happening and that ratio of carbon to nitrogen, which does that ratio influences how soil microorganisms can use that nitrogen, and potentially has an influence on those nitrous oxide emissions. But as far as I'm aware, with the calculations that I've seen in YEN Zero and within the UK greenhouse gas inventory, that ratio of carbon to nitrogen isn't considered.
Hope that answers your question there. We'll move on to the next one. So we've got from Saya, so it's, could you go into more detail around nitrogen loss if growers could provide application dates, soil conditions and rainfall around application?
So there are some carbon calculators that are starting to do that. So taking a more sort of temporal spatial approach to those calculations, and there is value in doing that. Obviously, it then becomes quite complicated to do those calculations. We're keeping it sort of fairly simple, and part of that is just that that sort of highlights the key driver of how much nitrogen is being applied. So we aren't having that potential issue of how nitrous oxide emissions might vary greatly between years because of the specific weather conditions, and that could potentially mean that a grower uses the same management conditions from one year to the next, but between years there's a big difference in the emissions, even though they're doing something exactly the same, just because of how weather conditions have changed. For simplicity, we are keeping it so that it doesn't matter what the weather conditions are for that particular year, the emissions will not be affected by that.
The next one is from Stanford. So he's asking for clarification, and might be for Will or you guys. So it says clarification on manure application as a mitigation measure of indirect emissions. My thinking was that manure application in crop production is a greenhouse gas emission activity under emissions from agricultural soils.
Sorry, can you repeat that question?
Sorry.
Please?
So the provide clarification on manure application as a mitigation measure of indirect emissions.
So in terms of the field emissions, the manures, that the indirect emissions can vary between the different types of nitrogen that's applied. With manures, you're reducing the emissions from the manufacturing of nitrogen, so obviously replacing that manufactured nitrogen. So you're avoiding some of those embedded emissions. But when it comes to the actual emissions that are happening in the field, you do have that potential increase in emissions because not all of the nitrogen within the manures is going to be available to the crop. Some of it is in organic form, and that means that's sort of released over time, so it's not immediately available to the crop, unlike, say, ammonium nitrate. And with organic manures, that means that you can have nitrogen being released after the crop's been harvested, for example. So you're potentially getting a loss of nitrogen happening then because the crop's not around to compete for that nitrogen. It's all available for the soil microorganisms. So potentially with manures, you can get those higher field emissions. And that's where it's vital that you balance the amount of nitrogen you're applying from your different sources, and you apply it at a time when the crop needs it, so it can be taking up that nitrogen, competing against those soil microorganisms. Hope that answers that question.
We have just got one more, and it's just a general one from Paul asking if research groups can get involved with YEN Zero.
I don't think we've collaborated with research groups yet, like universities, institutions, but it definitely is something we should pursue. Toby, have you had experience in previous YEN years?
So we haven't done anything yet, but we have been talking about whether we can start applying the YEN Zero to sort of different trial plots and and a key part of YEN Zero, something that we haven't done so far, but what we're looking to do is use this as a way of testing new approaches. So trying out new things, looking at innovation to understand how we can go about reducing emissions. So if there are opportunities to incorporate new research into YEN Zero, then that would be something we'd look to do.
Were there any other questions, Laurie, or was that everything?
No, that's them all in the chat there.
Okay. Well, thank you everyone for your questions there. If anything does crop up in the meantime, feel free to email the yen0@adas.co.uk website web address, and we will get back to you with an answer for that one. We're now going to move on to our polls, which are all around sort of the challenges and opportunities of reducing nitrogen emissions from crop production. So I'll pop these up on the screen now. I'll launch the first one, and that should come up. Second, launch. Okay, so this is anonymous, so feel free. You can select up to 3 options for the first question. 3 options for the second question, 3 options for the third question, and then you can select sort of 1 or 2 maybe for the last question, depending on what you think is a priority. And then we'll go through the results of these. Has this come up for anyone, Laurie or Toby? Has this come up on your screen at all? It has, yeah?
Yeah, it has.
Thank you. Okay, so at the moment, I wonder if I can share these live. I can share them live. So for the first question, we've got a bit of a balance at the moment. So this is, what are the main challenges faced when tackling nitrogen emissions? As people are putting their answers through, the weather is coming out as the most important challenge. We've also got yield impacts coming through as quite an important challenge. If anyone selects other and they want to elaborate on that, then we can enable your microphone and camera. So you can, if you've had, particular incidents, for example, that you want to talk about, then please do feel free to do that. Let's have a look at some of the other ones. So for question 2, which is looking at what opportunities and co-benefits are there for reducing nitrogen emissions, the most important one coming up is reduced cost of inputs for that one, but we've also got less water pollution, improved soil health coming through as quite strong things. Biodiversity benefits, not as much for an opportunity or co-benefit for this one. And then for poll 3, which is how to ensure that farmers are supported in taking steps to reduce nitrogen emissions, the clear winner so far is knowledge exchange. And I think that's one of the key parts of doing these sorts of webinars and workshops, is sharing information, at a fairly high level about what we can do to reduce emissions and what the more successful practices are. And a big part of joining YEN Zero, if you are a grower or if you know growers who'd be interested in this, is how we can work as a community to do that piece. And then for the 4th poll, this is what should farmers prioritise to reduce their nitrous oxide footprint? And the first one that's coming up is a nutrient management plan. About a third of people are saying we need to put more nutrient management plans in place. I imagine this is already a fairly popular mitigation strategy. So, for the people that aren't doing this, is a really huge opportunity to lower emissions of nitrous oxide in this case. Some of the other key bits that are coming through is swapping in organics, so our manures, slurries, potentially even digestates and composts and things like that for our manufactured N. Just remember with that one that when we're using organics, we don't have that embedded nitrogen fertilizer footprint. And for that winter wheat example near the beginning of this talk, that was sort of, 1/5 to a quarter of emissions. So if you can halve that, at least by halving the amount of manufactured nitrogen you're putting on your field, that's a big improvement to your crop footprint. I'll just keep these open just for another minute or so longer, just while more people are coming through. We've had quite a few responses now. Yeah, so I think we've probably had everyone's responses now. The weather was definitely the biggest challenge faced when tackling nitrogen emissions. I think Toby illustrated that quite nicely, the fact that it's the conditions in which you apply that nitrogen that has a huge impact on nitrous oxide emissions. Someone did, well, we've got 5% of the audience have put other. Anyone who's put other for the first question, if you want to turn on your camera and microphone and explain maybe what other challenges you think farmers might be facing, then please do feel free to do so. We can have a bit of a discussion about that. In the meantime, for the poll 2, opportunities and co-benefits, it's definitely the reduced cost of inputs that's coming through as the shining one. Yeah, knowledge exchange for poll 3. Nutrient management plans. Does anyone want to suggest any other options that maybe we haven't considered in our polls? Because obviously this was, things that we've encountered in YEN Zero, and from communication with our growers, what kind of things have come up in the past. But someone might have a very different experience of challenges of implementing nitrous oxide mitigation practices, and the mitigation sort of tree that we presented before and the list, not all of those things will be applicable to every farmer. So actually you might have a very different situation with that. Oh, I can see we've got one hand up. Is it Keris?
Yeah, hi. I think I should put my camera on. Sorry, too many things at once. I think I can't even remember the questions now, but I think I definitely ticked other. And yeah. I think I was thinking about the balance between nitrogen and all the other nutrients required to support good crop growth. I think there's always such a focus on nitrogen, and the need for that balanced nutrition also almost gets forgotten sometimes. So that's what I meant by other.
Okay, yeah, wonderful. Yeah, no worries. Okay. I think we've had all the responses from that one. Some very clear kind of results coming out of that piece. So we're finishing a little bit early today, which is a surprise. I thought we were going to be finishing bang on time, but never mind, we'll let you get off and grab a cuppa. So thank you very much for attending our webinar today. It's been a really useful kind of hopefully knowledge exchange piece about nitrogen emissions and what we can do and what YEN Zero does in this space. And if you are a grower, or if you know growers who might be interested in having a footprint done and joining the network, please do feel free to get in touch. As I said, we do have some sponsored entries left for this year. And hopefully you found this informative and not too doom and gloom about emissions. I think a lot of these webinars do end up a bit of a misery piece about it. So hopefully we've brought a little bit of inspiration to the people that have attended this. And just lastly, a big thank you to our sponsors again for supporting the network, and thanks to everyone for coming to the session. If you have any questions that you didn't put in the Q&A or afterthoughts, please do feel free to email through and we'll get back to you with a response. And just lastly, if you are collecting basis and Neroso points, then please do feel free to put your information in the chat or email the YEN Zero inbox, and we will get that registered for you. Thank you very much. I don't think I have anything else to add there. Toby, do you have anything else to add on the end, or no? Okay, wonderful. Well, thanks everyone. Hope you enjoy the rest of your week.